Beyond the headlines, the noise, the spin, we seek the stories that live within. Past party lines, past powers disguised, we hear the truth in everyday lives. A space for voices both gentle and strong, beyond politics where we all belong.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Politics on Oz Arab Media, where we take the time to understand how decisions that shape our lives are actually made. Before we start, I'd like to thank Laurent Hair Salon for always taking care of my hair. And today, I'm joined by Kellie Sloane, the leader of the opposition in New South Wales and the member for Vaucluse. Kellie brings a unique perspective to public life, shaped by her background in journalism, her experience as a community advocate, and her current role as holding government to account. Today's conversation matters because opposition doesn't just critique policy, it plays a crucial role in scrutiny, alternatives, and democratic balance. Kellie, welcome to the show.
It is so great to be here, and it's so wonderful to be with your audience on Oz Arab Media. So thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you so much, Kellie. We really appreciate your time with us today. I always like to start to tell people that usually before the titles and the headlines, there's always a person behind the role. So before we talk politics, if you can tell us who you were and how these values shaped where you are today.
Well, first and foremost, before politics, I'm a mum and I'm a wife. My husband Adam and I have 3 boys. They're all taller than me now, growing very fast.
Yeah.
But I grew up in the country in South Australia in a small town, went to the local public school, had an upbringing that was, based in community values, that you look after community, you look after family, and everything else comes later. So
Amazing.
I guess that's where my value system is from your mum and dad and from your broader family, and family is something that I value very much.
Right. And we heard from the introduction that you have a background in journalism.
Yes.
How did that take you to politics?
So when I left high school, I did, lots of work experience in places like this, in community radio and broadcasting, and eventually got a job as a cadet reporter at the ABC, ABC Radio. So that was my very first role. Right. And then, journalism saw me move to Sydney with the Channel 9 network. So I did a range of things at Channel 9 over about 14 years.
Wow.
I was a Today Show host. I read the news. I got to travel around Australia and overseas, reporting on, events of all sorts, whether it was reporting on tragedies and natural disasters, floods and bushfires, terrible things, standing with people in those moments, and times of celebration for people. I got to do some fun stuff. I got to cover the Oscars. I got to, meet celebrities. But that was where I got to interview every Prime Minister over my period of time at Channel 9. And it really sort of, I guess, sparked the bug for politics as well.
Amazing. Wow, what an opportunity. Kellie, what is the experience that has had you the biggest influence on how you really approach, if I can say, leadership and decision making?
I think that really came from when I left journalism. So I was at Channel 9 for 14 years, and then I did a bit of stuff with Channel 7. But increasingly, I wanted to play a role in the change that I wanted to see in people's lives and really kind of give back to the community. So I started doing some not-for-profit work. I was on the board of a charity called Miracle Babies Foundation based in Liverpool, an incredible charity there that supported premature babies and their parents and families. And then I was fortunate enough to get a role as the CEO of Life Education New South Wales. So this is Healthy Harold, goes around to the schools.
Oh, who doesn't know Healthy Harold?
Who doesn't know Harold, right? The giraffe that goes around and basically teaches children about how to better look after their bodies and their minds, to be good friends, to be cyber safe and all of that stuff.
Amazing.
And so it was that time, working with teachers and schools and families and communities right across New South Wales and then across Australia, that gave me a real understanding of the problems that families were facing the challenges they had, but also the hopes and the dreams they had for their kids. And that was really influential and very defining for me. And it was when I was working at Life Education that I thought perhaps I could play a role in politics and make the kind of change that I wanted for families, to make sure families are at the centre of everything that we do. Making sure that they have choices for their kids, that they have the kind of education that they want for their kids, healthcare systems that support their families. You know, that's really important. And making sure they have the opportunities and financial opportunities to live, a really good life.
Amazing. We will definitely talk about the health services coming forward. What's the moment, Kellie, that you realised that public office has brought in some sacrifice and cost? And how do you really reconcile that?
It's, I think for everyone in politics, it comes at a personal cost because you start very early in the morning and you finish late at night. And for me, the thing that's most important to me in life is family, and you have to give up family time. But I have to say there wasn't a particular moment that I understood that more than not. I went into it with my eyes wide open, and my husband and our boys, we talked about it before I entered politics, and we knew that there would be a sacrifice. I think, to be honest, I would have found this job incredibly hard when the kids were younger because I was the primary carer, but my husband is very supportive, and so, there is that cost, but I have to say it's overcome by the good that you get back. It's rewarding. It's so rewarding. It is. Yeah. So I think sometimes the toughest things in life are the most rewarding.
Wow.
You think about people who work that extra job so they can get their kids the education they want. It's hard, but the reward's there and you're doing it for a reason. Or you think about the times that you study at night to get your degree while you've got another job. Lots of people do that. So hard. You have moments where you go, what am I doing?
Yes.
But there's a reason. And I feel the same way about politics. It's going to be hard, but it's a privilege. Not many people get the opportunity to do what I do and make a contribution. So you just got to lean into it hard and know that for the most part, it's tremendously enjoyable, and you get to meet people from, all sorts of areas of Sydney that you wouldn't ordinarily meet. And our state and the regional areas too.
That's true. While I have you a little bit emotional there, I'd like to ask you, what do you think most people or public misunderstand about you as a person, not as a politician?
Maybe that I am a person. And
they forget that you're a person.
But also actually maybe they think of me, because I've only been in politics for 3 years. It's a short amount of time. Spent more time out of politics than in it. So I'm not a creature of politics and political movement. But also perhaps the other misunderstanding is I represent the eastern suburbs. That's my local constituency. But I'm more than that. I've worked in Western Sydney. I grew up in country, in the country. I've had jobs that have taken me all over the state and around the country. So perhaps, that's something I'd like to talk about a little bit more, is the experience that I bring into the role.
Amazing. Well, we'd like to learn about you more, and that's maybe the main reason for the podcast today. Okay, let's look a little bit about talk about politics and look at a policy that you've recently highlighted, which is the new men's health portfolio. You just mentioned, the health issues, as well as, talk about a little bit about mental health. Now, for viewers who might not have heard about this yet, what exactly is the Men's Health Initiative that your team has proposed, and what gap is it trying to fill in the current situation?
So I have announced that if we were elected in March next year, I would appoint a men's health portfolio. There's a really important reason for that. First of all, this is obviously an area of great personal importance to me. I'm a mum of 3 boys.
Yes.
But we all have dads and uncles and grandfathers and sons and brothers. And I think what has really struck me is that there are big gaps when it comes to the mental and physical health of men and boys. Men die on average 4 years younger. For young men aged between 15 to 35, the leading cause of death is suicide.
Oh, wow.
And these are figures that should absolutely stop us in our tracks. They're more likely to have cardiovascular disease. They're more likely to go to prison. They're more likely to be homeless than women. Why is that? Why are we failing our men and boys? And I think particularly at the moment, post the whole Me Too movement, which was very important in terms of understanding women's struggles, and very brave women spoke up at that time about, inequalities. But I feel like we've forgotten our boys, and we need to talk about our boys and our men to make sure that we are understanding why they're not going to the GP as much as women go to the GP, why when they go to the GP they have a poor experience, why they're more likely to suffer from heart attacks, why they're less likely to talk about their mental health. And I think we really need to lean into that and have a proper men's health strategy. So we've announced that we would have a comprehensive men's health strategy, and that I would have someone appointed to look after that, to make sure that we don't just talk about it, that we get stuff done.
Amazing. And it does sound very important and statistically crazy. You've spoken about celebrating masculinity, and improving health outcomes for both boys and men. Can you explain, please, why that perspective matters for public health in a way that everyone can understand it, not much of political techniques?
I feel like when we talk about men, so often we talk about toxic masculinity, why they're bad, what they've done wrong, why, and I think we need to shift that. We need to celebrate masculinity and say good masculinity, good men are to be celebrated. I think it's important because I believe that there is this whole generation of what I've called lost boys, young men who don't know their place in the world, who don't know how to be strong. And the internet is making this worse because there are extreme role models on both sides of this. There are people who are saying that men are bad the whole time, and then you have these extreme influencers that are being fed through social media and the algorithms who provide really poor role models for men. I think we need something in the middle where we're promoting healthy masculinity. We want our blokes to be blokes, and the majority of men are very good men. So how do we shift this conversation and start lifting men and praising them and giving them a sense of, I'm proud to be who I am? Because clearly we're failing if the leading cause of death in young men is suicide. What's going wrong? What can we do to prevent it?
Yes.
And by the way, this doesn't mean we forget about women.
No,
I'm a
not at all.
champion for women. And also I believe that we'll have healthier and happier women if our blokes are happy too.
True.
Because you know what it's like. Women are the carers most, often of their husbands, of their fathers, of their kids. But also we know that women face increasingly high rates of domestic violence and assault.
Yes.
And we need to address that as well.
Yes. If we want to talk about this, we can talk for ages. There's a lot to talk about in mental health. What are the measurable outcomes, Kellie, you're hoping that this policy will achieve if it were implemented?
Well, I think there's a few things. And first of all, clearly we're not going to solve this overnight.
Yes.
But I think it starts with a plan. There was a plan that the former coalition government introduced in 2018, a men's health strategy. But then COVID hit, a year and a bit later. And then nothing's happened since. I want a new, revised, updated men's health strategy with measurables. And there's organisations that do great work and have offered up policy solutions, people like the Movember Foundation.
Yes.
Some of the things they're talking about and the evidence and the research is showing is that men are less likely to go to the GP, to the doctor.
Yes.
And if they do, it's often a bad experience. So one of the simple things, and it's because doctors don't talk, they talk to men and women in the same way. Now, women offer up information more readily. We're better talkers.
That's true.
And blokes often say that they have a bad experience at the GP, or they feel like they're not heard or understood, and so they don't bother going back again. So one of the suggestions is that in medical school, GPs could have specialist training in how to speak to men. So there's sort of gender-specific ideas around how you can talk to people when they're in your practice.
Bring more information out of them because they don't bring it out as women.
That's right.
Oh, wow.
The other thing is just to bring men's health services to the places men hang out, at sporting clubs, even at the pub, at community areas, at men's sheds, so that we're taking that to men. And I think some of the things that we can measure are increase in GP visits, increase in preventative health measures. We can also be giving information packs to new dads, like we give information packs to new mums, do that as well. Ultimately, the measurables will be that we are closing the gap when it comes to those different health outcomes around cardiovascular disease, other significant disease, but also reducing, importantly, the mental health burden on young men and lowering that suicide rate.
That sounds really theoretically lovely, but we are hoping that this is just not a proposal on paper. And if we want to talk a little bit about when you and your team are shaping policies like that, as in opposition situation, what are the main barriers you face in getting it seriously taken by the government?
Well, when we're in opposition, it's really hard because we don't have access to the Department of Health. We can't shape the laws. But I think if we take a really positive approach, this is not an attack on the government. This started well before the current government was in power. It happened over, a build-up of governments, successive governments over a matter of time. So this is not a blame game. Right. This is something I really want to engage the government on and say, even if you stay in power and you win the next election, we want you to do this. And I'll work constructively with you to make that happen.
Okay.
I'd obviously prefer that we're in government. That's my job. But this is something that we need to work in a bipartisan fashion on and make sure it's not political. And the area where I think we can make a big difference is to lean in and utilise and lift up the work of organisations like Movember, who have collated information, released documents, have done the policy work. It's there. We just need to do something with it.
Amazing. How does the process change when you're in opposition versus when you're in government? Because you said it's hard when you're in opposition. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, I believe, one of my most important roles, it's obviously one, to try to win the next election. Yes. That's important. But secondly, it's critically important to be a really strong opposition because that makes a better government in New South Wales. If the government's always looking over its shoulder and going, what's Kellie going to say? What's she going to do? What will she say about this policy that we're presenting? Then they're going to, dot every dot and they're going to cross every T and it's going to be better policy as a result. So I need to do that. And that's how we, I think that's an important role of opposition. But we have been able to work with the government constructively on ideas that we're bringing forward. So not to be always opposing as an opposition, but to be constructive. And look, we did that just in the last week around fuel prices and fuel excise. We're going through a period of time where, we all know it's so expensive to fill up at the Bowser. We introduced legislation, which would put a price cap for 24 hours to give consumers a bit of certainty. But we also wrote to the Prime Minister. I wrote to the Prime Minister and said, please consider a cut in the fuel excise. Yes. And that happened.
It did.
Now, I'm not saying I can claim success for that, but we're part of a building up of pressure that enabled that to happen. So I think there's power in opposition in putting a strong position forward. And sometimes when the ideas are good, the government takes us up on it. And we've been able to do that through policies around online safety for women that the government ended up supporting, around illicit tobacco shops, which the government ended up supporting, and also around, increased penalties for people desecrating war memorials, vandalising them. Yeah. That was our idea again. The government took it on board. So I think we've been a really positive and productive opposition. And, that's good practice for when we get in government again. We'll just keep those ideas moving.
well, we wish you all the luck. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
There are typically competing priorities, definitely, in government, especially when spending on health. What tough decisions are inevitable when you want to push for new initiatives?
So that's such a good question, like particularly with the health budget, because it is the population is growing, the cost of health is growing. The population in particular parts of Sydney is growing faster than other areas. So there's give and take.
Yes.
One of the big criticisms that I have had is that, the government has had 3 budgets so far, and the first 2, there were real cuts to health, which I think is unfortunate. And as a result of that, choices have to be made about where you can put funding and where you can't.
Right.
But I think one of the biggest areas and the biggest missed opportunities is spend on prevention.
Okay.
Because we're paying to fix people up when they're sick. We're paying for the results of not addressing obesity earlier, of not supporting communities around early intervention and prevention that would really make a difference. So this is one of those tough decisions where you have to make a decision to spend more on prevention, and you're not going to see the results probably for potentially 10 years or so.
Yes.
So it's not going to happen in the same political cycle. These are the really difficult decisions governments are going to have to make, and something that I'm very committed to.
But on the side, if I can say, government has been implementing a lot on Medicare recently. So what's your take about that?
Yeah. Well, I know that a lot of people I've been speaking to around here and other parts of Sydney felt, quite frankly, pretty ripped off after the federal election because Albanese was going around with his Medicare card saying that's all you'll need if you go into a GP. We're going to... And the reality of that hasn't matched what was promised. And people in the weeks and the months after the federal election were turning up to their GP and they still have to pay that big gap. So I think primary care has become very expensive.
Right.
And this is where I'm in lockstep with the state Labor government. Like Liberals and Labor agree that the federal government needs to be doing more when it comes to health and supporting the states. At the moment, we've got a huge crisis with bed block in our hospitals, where a lot of our elderly people are stuck in the hospitals because the federal government hasn't provided enough aged care beds.
Right.
We've got a problem where when people can't get to a GP because they were promised it by Albo and then he didn't deliver, that they're getting stuck and going into emergency departments instead of into GP clinics.
Right.
So this is something that Labor and Liberals at state level agree on. We want the federal government to be doing a better job.
Amazing. So while we are grounding things down, let's go back to the policy, the men's mental health policy we were speaking about, and see if this policy was to be implemented, how would my dad, my son, my little man, my neighbor, how would they really see a difference in day-to-day health?
So it's such a good thing to be asking. I've got broad ideas, but what we and I'll come back to that in a moment, but we haven't done the full strategy yet.
Right.
We're committed to developing a strategy that would outline those things in a very tangible way. But some of the things would be that, your dad or your brother or your little boy would know that when they go to the GP, it would be a better experience.
Yes.
That if they're reluctant to go to the GP or think, she'll be right, mate, I'll be okay, I don't need any help, that when they go to footy training, there would be someone there with a little pop-up stand that could say, hey, we're going to do your blood pressure tests and go and get your bowel screen test if you're over 50, and just come to those places. That would better support community organisations like men's sheds or, more information, particularly, I believe, for migrant communities that maybe don't understand how they can go and what support they can get. We should be coming to them in language and doing more of it. It's happening at the moment, but we need more of that. So they're the kinds of things that you would tangibly see. And then specialist support services for men's mental health as well.
Amazing. So you really wanted to see men's mental health in action on grounds.
Absolutely.
Right. All right. But what would you say to critics who might see that this initiative they see it as symbolic rather than really practical. Okay, it looks good on paper, but it might not look good practically. What would you say beyond that?
And fair enough, because I think people get quite cynical about politics and say there's a lot of hot air, but not a lot of action. I'm saying that it's something I'm personally very committed to, and by appointing someone who would be effectively a minister for men, they are accountable to make sure that this is working, not just in health, but across the board. We also know that our boys are falling behind girls when it comes to educational outcomes as well.
Right.
So there's a whole sort of range of areas where I think we can make a big difference. And to the critics, I'd say, keep applying the pressure on me. Just like I apply pressure on government,
I was going to say.
apply that pressure on me. Hold me accountable. And, in a few years from now, say, Kellie, what did you actually do to make this happen? Because I need to be accountable to people. We can't just talk about this. It's far too serious.
Right.
I need to be able to say to you, here's the strategy. Here's where we're spending the money. Here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to save lives and improve lives.
Amazing. Now, looking ahead for 2027 state election, what's your commitment to the community on this policy, and how would success look to you?
Yeah. Well, I think it has to be broader than this policy as well. So this policy is important, but really we're making a commitment to a strategy and a minister and working with those grassroots organisations. I think communities right across our state, including the communities you're speaking to, want us to make a real difference on cost of living, want us to provide policies that will help their kids afford a house one day, that when we're delivering, planning proposals for new developments, that there's infrastructure and there's transport, that we're keeping their communities safe, that we're making sure Revesby Police Station is adequately resourced, or the hospitals are well resourced and built. They're going to be the key policies that people care about. Because I know wherever I go in Sydney, right across the communities around here where we're broadcasting from or beyond, people are just finding it really tough right now. They feel like they're working harder than they've ever worked, but everything's just getting so expensive. And we need to commit to people that will make that better. And I think this is something that Liberal governments have done very well, very strong economic managers, Liberal governments. When we left government at the last election, we were the top performing state in the country when it comes to growth. We're now the bottom out of every state in the country just 3 years later. So I think people want strong economic policies. And when we have a strong economy, we can afford to look after people's health and well-being, like the men's health strategies. We can afford to open more schools. We can afford to build the infrastructure that we need because our roads are getting so congested and more people are living in our communities, but they're not feeling like they're getting served properly by the basics. And state governments should just do the basics really well. Health, education, roads, and then get out of people's lives. Let them live the lives they want to live. Don't tell them how to think, how to worship, who they love, any of that stuff. That's not government's role. Our role is to say, you educate your kids, you raise them the way you want to raise them, but we're going to make sure that you're looked after. If you're paying your taxes, you're getting good health, good roads.
For it.
It shouldn't be rocket science at state level. We just got to get those fundamentals right, and that's what we're committed to.
Amazing. This has been a great conversation, and I wish I have more time to ask you more questions. That's amazing. But before we end it, Kellie, you look very passionate and motivated. What keeps you motivated to continue serving, especially at a time where people are starting to lose trust in politics, if I can say?
Do you know, I think that's a fair assessment. I think people are really... They've lost a lot of faith in politics because they feel like life is harder and what are we doing about it? And I get that. I think people are really frustrated at the moment. I just try to be myself. I try to be real about it, admit when we're getting it right, admit when we're getting it wrong. But I get motivated by being out in the community. I have to say, I said to my staff today as we were driving in to see you, I love nothing more than getting out of the office. Like
you see the people,
being with the people, that fills up my cup. That makes me because people are amazing. And while there's a lot of distrust in politicians, and I get that, most people are really appreciative. Whether they vote for me or not, most people come up and say, thank you for the work that you do, and here are my ideas. And so it's a real privilege. So it's really the people that motivate me.
Amazing.
And they make me very grateful for the job, but also make me absolutely determined to ensure that they are leading better lives with more opportunity.
Amazing. And if I can add something to that, there you are people, as we mentioned at the beginning, like, like there's a person behind politics and that's what matters from a person to a person when we talk, regardless if it's politics or not. So that brings me to the end of it. And to let me say, thank you so much for coming in today, for your time, for this amazing, talk, openness, willingness, whatever you want to call it. Thank you so much again, Kellie.
Thank you so much for having me.
No worries at all. And before we end, I always like to say something to our viewers. Thank you for being part of this conversation, you too. Staying informed doesn't mean choosing sides. It means understanding the system that affects us all. And until next time, I want you to stay curious, engaged, and remember, there's always more to politics than we see at first glance.